In the twilight of the 19th century, the world map was a tapestry of pink. The color represented the British Empire, the largest dominion in human history, an entity so vast that it was said the sun never set upon it. From the bustling wharves of Hong Kong to the diamond mines of South Africa, from the icy wastes of the Canadian North to the sheep stations of Australia, Queen Victoria reigned supreme. Her navy, the Royal Navy, possessed a dominance over the world's oceans that had not been challenged since the days of Napoleon. London was not just a capital city. It was the beating heart of the global financial system, the clearinghouse of world trade, and the arbiter of international law. To the British ruling class, the Victorian aristocracy who managed this colossal enterprise from the leather armchairs of their clubs on Pall Mall, the world was orderly. It was hierarchical. And it was British. Across the Atlantic Ocean, however, a different kind of power was stirring. The United States of America was a nation that the European powers viewed with a complex mixture of condescension and unease. For most of the century, the Americans had been looked upon as distant cousins, uncultured, loud, and obsessed with their own internal expansion. They had spent decades slaughtering each other in a civil war, and then slaughtering the indigenous tribes of the West to secure their continent. But by 1895, the frontier was closed. The American project of internal conquest was complete, and the energy that had driven the pioneers across the prairies was now turning outward. The United States had quietly undergone a metamorphosis. While Britain was policing its far-flung colonies, America was building factories. Its steel output had surpassed Britain's. Its railway network dwarfed the rest of the world combined. Its population was exploding, fueled by waves of immigrants hungry for work. It was a sleeping giant, a coiled spring of industrial potential that had no outlet. The American economy was prone to violent booms and busts, and the Depression of 1893 had left the country angry, restless, and looking for a distraction. There was a rising spirit of jingoism, a feeling that America had grown up and deserved a seat at the table of great powers. These two tectonic plates, the descending trajectory of an overstretched British Empire and the ascending trajectory of an aggressive American republic, were destined to collide. And the collision point would not be a major strategic hub like the Suez Canal or the Straits of Gibraltar. It would be a steaming, mosquito-infested patch of jungle on the shoulder of South America that appeared on most maps as a blank space. A place so obscure that most diplomats had to consult an atlas just to find it. Yet this forgotten corner of the world would become the stage for a confrontation that would reshape the balance of global power for the next century. The dispute between Venezuela and Great Britain was one of those colonial headaches that had dragged on for so long that most diplomats had forgotten how it started. It dated back to 1814, when Britain acquired the colony of British Guiana from the Dutch at the end of the Napoleonic Wars. The Dutch had never really defined the western border of their territory because nobody cared about the dense rainforests of the Orinoco Basin. It was a green hell of swamps and jaguars, impenetrable and economically worthless. But empires abhor a vacuum. In 1835, the British government sent a German naturalist and surveyor named Robert Schomburgk to map the colony. Schomburgk drew a line on a map that would become infamous. The Schomburgk line pushed the British boundary far to the west, claiming an additional 30,000 square miles and, most crucially, the mouth of the Orinoco River, which was the commercial artery of Venezuela. The Venezuelans protested immediately. They pointed to old Spanish maps that showed their territory extending all the way to the Essequibo River. The British ignored them. After all, what was Venezuela? A chaotic South American republic, politically unstable, economically backward, militarily insignificant. The British had warships. The Venezuelans had complaints. For decades, the matter festered. Diplomatic notes were exchanged. Meetings were held. Nothing changed. The British continued to push settlements westward, incrementally expanding their claim, inch by inch, mile by mile. Then, in 1876, everything changed. Gold was discovered in the disputed territory. Suddenly, the worthless jungle became valuable. The stakes escalated. Britain, with the audacity of empire, extended their claim an additional 33,000 square miles beyond even the Schomburg Key line, swallowing up the gold-bearing regions. Venezuela was outraged. But outrage without power is merely noise. In 1887, Venezuela broke off diplomatic relations with Britain entirely, a gesture of defiance that London barely noticed. The British Foreign Office filed the Venezuelan protests in the same drawer where they kept complaints from dozens of other minor nations who lacked the military strength to enforce their grievances. But Venezuela had one card left to play. They appealed to the United States, invoking an old American doctrine that had been gathering dust since 1823, the Monroe Doctrine. President James Monroe had declared, 70 years earlier, that the Western Hemisphere was closed to European colonization, and that any attempt by European powers to extend their influence in the Americas would be considered a hostile act. For most of the 19th century, this doctrine had been little more than words on paper. America lacked the naval power to enforce it. But by 1895, that was changing. For nearly 2 decades, Venezuela petitioned Washington for help. They cited the Monroe Doctrine. They pleaded for arbitration. They begged for intervention. And for nearly 2 decades, the United States responded with polite concern and did absolutely nothing. American presidents and secretaries of state expressed sympathy, made vague promises, and then moved on to other matters. Britain was a great power. Venezuela was not. The calculus seemed simple. Then came 1895, and 2 men whose collision of personalities and ambitions would turn this forgotten boundary dispute into a global crisis. The first was President Grover Cleveland, a man of unbending principle and volcanic temper, a president who saw compromise as weakness and who believed that America's word, once given, was sacred. The second was Richard Olney, Cleveland's new Secretary of State, a bulldog of a lawyer with an ego the size of Texas and a conviction that America was destined to dominate the Western Hemisphere. On July 20, 1895, Olney sent a note to the British government that would become known as Olney's 20-inch gun. It was 12,000 words long, a diplomatic document that read like a declaration of war. Olney demanded that Britain submit the entire Venezuelan boundary dispute to arbitration, not partial arbitration, not negotiation. Full arbitration of every square mile in dispute. And he invoked the Monroe Doctrine with language so aggressive, so uncompromising, that it stunned the British Foreign Office. Today, Olney wrote, the United States is practically sovereign on this continent, and its fiat is law upon the subjects to which it confines its interposition. This was not diplomacy. This was a statement of hegemony. Olney was declaring, in effect, that the Americas were an American sphere of influence and that European powers had no business expanding their territories there. He was rewriting the rules of international relations, asserting a right to intervene that no previous American administration had dared to claim so baldly. The British response was delayed, dismissive, and catastrophic. Lord Salisbury, the British Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary, a man of aristocratic hauteur who viewed Americans as upstart colonials, did not even bother to reply for 4 months. When his response finally arrived in November, it was a masterclass in condescension. Salisbury rejected arbitration outright. He dismissed the Monroe Doctrine as legally irrelevant. He stated that Britain would decide what to do with its colonial territory, and the United States had no standing to interfere. It was, in essence, a diplomatic no. And it was the worst miscalculation of Lord Salisbury's career. President Cleveland received Salisbury's note on December 7, 1895, and his reaction was volcanic. He spent the weekend drafting a message to Congress that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of American foreign policy. On December 17, 1895, Cleveland addressed Congress and the nation. He invoked the Monroe Doctrine with an uncompromising clarity that shocked even his own cabinet. He announced that the United States would unilaterally determine the proper boundary line between Venezuela and British Guiana, conduct its own investigation, and then, most explosively, enforce that boundary by every means in Cleveland's message explicitly threatening war with Britain over Venezuelan boundary. Direct ultimatum that America would fight Britain if necessary. States would go to war with Great Britain over a patch of jungle in South America if Britain did not submit to American arbitration. The reaction was instantaneous and global. Stock markets on both sides of the Atlantic plunged. The New York Stock Exchange experienced its worst single-day collapse since the Panic of 1893. In London, the financial district reeled. War between the United States and Britain, the two great English-speaking powers, seemed inconceivable. And yet, the prospect loomed. Newspapers in both nations fed the hysteria. British tabloids shrieked about American arrogance. American newspapers screamed about British imperialism. Both countries began mobilizing their navies. The Royal Navy, the most powerful maritime force on the planet, began preparing for a potential transatlantic conflict. American shipyards accelerated production of new battleships. There was genuine talk of war, and not just in the taverns and editorial offices, but in the war departments of both nations. For weeks, the world held its breath. And then, slowly, sanity began to reassert itself. The British establishment, upon sober reflection, realized the enormity of what they were contemplating. A war with the United States would be a logistical nightmare, politically divisive within Britain itself, and strategically ruinous. Britain's empire was already overstretched, facing challenges in South Africa, India, and Ireland. A war in the Western Hemisphere would require diverting resources from those critical theaters. And for what? A boundary dispute in a jungle that most British officials could not locate on a map without assistance. Moreover, British financial interests understood the economic realities. Britain and the United States were each other's largest trading partners. A war would devastate both economies. The City of London, the financial heart of the empire, made its views clear to the government. War was unacceptable. By January 1896, both sides were quietly looking for a way out. Behind the scenes, the diplomatic machinery began to grind into motion. Britain needed to save face while backing down from a position it had staked out for decades. The solution came in the form of compromise that looked like concession. In February 1896, Britain agreed to submit the Venezuelan boundary dispute to arbitration. The terms were carefully worded to allow Britain to claim it was acting voluntarily, not under American coercion. But everyone understood the reality. America had forced Britain's hand. The crisis had revealed a fundamental shift in the balance of power. For the first time since the War of 1812, the United States had directly challenged Great Britain on a matter of international law and had forced Britain to back down. The arbitration process itself was revealing. It was structured to favor Venezuela, with the United States acting as mediator. The tribunal consisted of 2 British representatives, 2 American representatives chosen by the U.S. Supreme Court to represent Venezuela, and a 5th neutral arbitrator. The Venezuelan government, ecstatic that the great powers were finally addressing their claim, enthusiastically agreed to the process. On October 3, 1899, the arbitration tribunal delivered its verdict, and here the historical irony reveals itself with savage clarity. The tribunal awarded nearly all the disputed territory to Britain. The border was drawn roughly along the original Schomburgk line. Venezuela, the supposed victim, the nation on whose behalf the United States had nearly gone to war, received only a sliver of the contested land, losing control of the vast majority of the territory they had claimed. Britain lost only the mouth of the Orinoco River and about 5,000 square miles at the southern end of the line, a minor concession that cost them nothing of strategic value. Venezuela had won the arbitration and lost everything. The Venezuelans were devastated, quietly ratifying a decision that confirmed British control over what is now more than half of modern Guyana. The country they had fought to defend had been sacrificed on the altar of great power politics. The Venezuelan press, which had celebrated the American intervention, now published bitter editorials about betrayal and abandonment. But Venezuela's loss was beside the point. This crisis had never really been about Venezuela. It had been about power, prestige, and the unspoken question of who would dominate the Western Hemisphere in the coming century. The Americans, despite Venezuela's territorial defeat, celebrated the outcome as a diplomatic triumph. And in the calculus of great power politics, they were absolutely correct. The specific border location mattered far less than what the process itself had established. The United States had forced Britain, through the credible threat of war, to accept arbitration on American terms. Washington had asserted veto power over European territorial ambitions in the Americas. The precedent was set, the principle established, the new order recognized. Within 3 years, this newfound American assertiveness would manifest in Cuba, where the Spanish-American War of 1898 would demolish what remained of Spain's colonial empire and establish the United States as a Caribbean power. The Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, the territorial spoils of that conflict, transformed America from a continental republic into a transoceanic empire virtually overnight. The path from Venezuela to Manila Bay was direct and deliberate. The true significance of the Venezuelan crisis was not in who controlled a jungle border, it was in what the crisis established about power in the world. By forcing Britain to accept arbitration, the United States had compelled the British Empire, the most powerful nation on earth, to acknowledge American authority in the Western Hemisphere. Britain had tacitly conceded that the Monroe Doctrine was not just American rhetoric, but American law, enforceable by American power. The crisis marked the moment when the United States announced itself as a world power, no longer a regional player, but a force capable of dictating terms to empire itself. The diplomatic revolution was complete, and both sides understood it. British Foreign Secretary Lord Salisbury, in private correspondence after the crisis, acknowledged that Britain could no longer afford confrontations with the United States. "We have to be very courteous and to give them their way in small things," he wrote. A remarkable admission from a man who had spent his career managing the affairs of the world's greatest empire. The British establishment began the painful process of accepting that the Atlantic world now had 2 centers of gravity, not one. London would share power with Washington, or risk losing it entirely. For Britain, the crisis was a strategic catastrophe disguised as a diplomatic resolution. By backing down, they had signaled to the world that British power had limits. that there were regions where even the Royal Navy could not impose its will. The Venezuela crisis became a pivot point, the beginning of Britain's long retreat from hemispheric dominance and the start of a strategic realignment that would culminate in the special relationship between Britain and America. Within 2 decades, Britain would need American partnership in the First World War. Within 3 decades, American loans would be propping up the British economy. The empire that had treated American demands with condescension in 1895 would be dependent on American goodwill by 1917. For the United States, the crisis was transformative. It was the first modern application of the Monroe Doctrine, the moment when American interventionism in Latin America shifted from aspiration to reality. Cleveland and Olney had established a precedent that would be invoked again and again. Every intervention, every occupation, every assertion of American prerogative in the Western Hemisphere for the next century traced its lineage back to December 17, 1895. The Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which would turn the United States into the self-appointed policeman of Latin America, was born in the Venezuelan crisis. The transformation in American foreign policy was immediate and profound. Within the halls of Congress, within the editorial rooms of major newspapers, within the minds of a new generation of American leaders, the Venezuela crisis had proven a fundamental truth. America was powerful enough to confront European empires and win. The psychological barrier had been shattered. The nation that had spent the 19th century expanding westward now looked outward, across oceans, toward new frontiers and new confrontations. The Spanish-American War would follow in 1898, the annexation of Hawaii the same year, the construction of the Panama Canal in the next decade. Each of these actions was justified, in part, by the Monroe Doctrine, as newly interpreted through the Venezuelan precedent. Theodore Roosevelt, who would become president in 1901, explicitly built his foreign policy on the foundations laid in 1895. His famous maxim, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," was a refinement of the approach that Cleveland and Olney had pioneered. Assert American dominance, back it with credible force, and compel European powers to respect American interests in the Western Hemisphere. The Venezuela crisis had proven that the big stick worked, that Britain would retreat when confronted with American resolve. Roosevelt would apply this lesson repeatedly in Panama, in the Dominicans Republic, in Cuba, transforming American power from potential into practice. And Venezuela, the nation saved from British expansion, found itself under a new hegemony. American economic influence flooded into the country. American companies gained preferential access to Venezuelan resources. The protection that Venezuela had sought became, over the decades, a different kind of domination. They had escaped one empire only to fall into the shadow of another. The Venezuelan crisis of 1895 was a forgotten crisis with world-shaping consequences. A boundary dispute in a jungle that no one cared about became the catalyst for a fundamental shift in global power. It was the moment when America stopped being a former colony and became an empire in its own right. The moment when Britain accepted that its century of unchallenged dominance was ending. The moment when the 20th century's power structure was born in the jungles of South America over a line on a map that almost no one could see. Britain won the arbitration, America won the world, and Venezuela learned what it meant to be saved by a great power.